Bramble, who is the executive director for Napoleon 200. We also will be hearing from James first, and then afterwards we'll be hearing from Sir Brian Unwin, who is an author and former British civil servant. And then last but by no means least, a good friend for those of you who are regular at football events. It's great to have Michael Binion with us from the Times. And we'll also be hearing from Michael at the end as well. And of course, tonight's theme and topic is the 200th anniversary of Napoleon's death. So on that note, I will now ask James Bramble if you would like to introduce yourself, and I'll just leave it to each speaker to kind of introduce what they'll be discussing as well. Thank you. Over to you, James, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Philip, and hello, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak to you all tonight. So I'm going to kick off the proceedings by talking a little bit about the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust and the Napoleon 200 appeal. I'm going to try not to tread on the toes of my co-speakers and talk too much about Napoleon or St. Helena. So I will be focusing very much on the charity and our objectives and how we came to exist. And I've got some slides that I'll also show. So the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust was set up in September of 2019 on behalf of the government of St. Helena with two objectives. Number one, to preserve the island's built heritage, much of which is at risk. And number two, to tell the fascinating and largely unknown story of Napoleon on St. Helena, which Brian in particular will tell you more about later. So I want to explain a little bit more about both of these two objectives. And what I will do now is I will open up my presentation. Hopefully you can see that. So when Napoleon arrived on St. Helena in 1815, the island was already very well defended, as it had been fortified heavily to protect against the Dutch in the 17th century and adapted since then by the East India Company. With the arrival of Napoleon on the island, these fortifications were even further adapted and expanded and strengthened. And hence, one of the legacies of Napoleon's time on the island is these fortifications, cannon batteries, flag stations, gatehouses, built to imprison him and to stop him essentially from escaping. Many of these fortifications and other military structures, despite the concerted efforts of the island's National Trust and the island's Heritage Society, have fallen into disrepair over time. So the trust was set up primarily to preserve these heritage sites, but to gather information on these and to understand the priorities for preservation, it was necessary to do some research. So we enlisted a chap called Brent Fortenberry, who's the Director of Preservation Studies at the Tulane School of Architecture in the United States, to conduct 3D drone scans of the sites and to produce detailed conservation management reports. These have enabled us to secure initial costings, mainly from construction firms in the UK, and allowed us to engage support in the UK, despite the island being 5,000 miles away and inaccessible for much of the last year due to COVID. So that's been a really essential part of our work. There are some images here of some of those scans, which don't really do them justice because they're obviously 3D images which can be manipulated. But we have here Banks Battery, which is an example of one of those batteries I mentioned, which is a 17th century fortification, which has then been subsequently adapted. High Knoll Fort, a spectacular fortification, mainly built in the Victorian period. And Longwood House, which of course is the house where Napoleon lived and died. And you might have seen that earlier if you were watching the bicentenary commemorations that we live streamed on our website. And finally, Toby's Cottage, more of which later. If you're interested in actually seeing the 3D scans in 3D, then please do visit our website, which is www.napoleon200.org. So these ruins tell the story of Napoleon's significance to global history and the British fear, even paranoia, of his escape. But they also tell stories which are less familiar and which we felt and still feel need to be heard. The Trust was set up to tell those stories, and this takes us to our second objective, that of promoting new perspectives on the story of Napoleon on St. Helena. There were many of these stories and many of these individuals who were in Napoleon's orbit and whose perspective on his time on St. Helena vary. These include Betsy Balcombe, the 15-year-old daughter of William Balcombe, who Napoleon lived with for his first 3 months on the island, and who went from fearing Napoleon as the Corsican ogre to playing games of blind man's buff with him. Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor of the island, who immediately fell out with Napoleon and became his bête noire, and Gideon Gorica, Lowe's aide-de-camp, who recorded his bitterness at his treatment by Lowe in coded memoirs that were only decoded in the 1960s. This is without touching on the numerous affairs, the petty jealousies, and the enduring questions about whether Napoleon's death was hastened, directly or indirectly, by being on St. Helena. But all of these stories, or rather of all these stories, one of the most compelling is that of Toby. When at the Briars, the house of the Balcombes, playing blind man's buff with Betsy Balcombe, Napoleon also befriended one of the enslaved people who worked for William Balcombe, an old man named Toby, who worked in the garden. According to contemporary accounts...
Right. Hello.
Oh. Tony. Okay. Napoleon was said to be moved by Toby's plight and have tried to buy his freedom. The juxtaposition of the slave and the emperor is striking, and it is a story that the island's honorary French consul, Michel Dancoin Martineau, has been keen to tell for some time. The Trust is therefore delighted to have committed funding to rebuild the cottage that Toby and other slaves were housed in, to show the conditions of the island's enslaved people of that period. We've committed £50,000 to it, and we just need to raise an additional £50,000 to deliver that project. This is a new perspective on the story of Napoleon on St. Helena. And for St. Helena, it is also an opportunity to address the island's significant part in the emergence, growth, and the suppression of the slave trade. Toby's cottage will explain the early emergence of the slaves trade on the island through the Honourable East India Company and their reach into East Africa and Southeast Asia. This early manifestation of the slave trade subsequently laid the foundation for what later became the transatlantic slave trade. If you'd like to learn more about the project, please do visit www.napoleon200.org. As I've mentioned, we're fundraising actively for it currently, and I'd encourage, of course, you all to please consider making a donation. We're currently offering a wide range of rewards for donations, from a postcard from the islands to a replica of a commemorative plaque to your name on a sign at the cottage itself. The rewards vary depending on the donation. And that's some of those recognition offerings here. Setting up the charity has been a long struggle since 2019. Fundraising for overseas territories, as I'm sure many of you watching will know, is always a struggle. The funding in the UK is very limited for the overseas territories, and the funding for the built heritage of the overseas territory is tiny. And then if you consider on top of that COVID, it's really been a very tough 2 years. In truth, there have been times when it looked like we might not even really get off the ground and the whole thing might collapse. But we have made good progress. We've been able to commit funding to Toby's cottage. We're confident that we'll be able to deliver that project. And I would just ask you to consider whether or not you could also make a contribution to that cause. Okay, at that point, I will hand over to Sir Brian Unwin.
Many thanks, James. Just by way of introduction for Sir Brian, he is an author and former British civil servant, having published 2 historical books on St. Helena and Napoleon. So I feel we are in very capable hands as we turn to Sir Brian for his part.
Well, am I on now?
You are indeed, yes.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me. And can I say, it's very special for me to talk to this group, because my first job in the civil service about 100 years ago was in the Commonwealth Relations Office, the CRO, which later merged with the Foreign Office to become the FCO. And I did 2 postings in Commonwealth countries. I was in the British High Commission in what was then the Rhodesian Federation, now Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. And then I did a spell as First Secretary in the British High Commission in Accra. So I have a thoroughly Commonwealth background. And my father-in-law was actually the Under-Secretary in the FCO in charge of the overseas territories. And in his last post, he was ambassador in South Africa, actually came back by sea on the MS St. Helena and called in at St. Helena. So I'm delighted to be able to talk about St. Helena tonight. What I'm going to do, and I'll do it as briefly as I can, is tell you the story of Napoleon on St. Helena. Andrew Roberts, with whom I had a vigorous debate about a fortnight ago about Napoleon and the governor, Andrew Roberts in his book, Napoleon and Wellington, describes the St. Helena story as a footnote to a footnote in history. Well, all I can say is some footnote. I think the St. Helena story is incredibly important for the understanding of Napoleon and his psychology. Napoleon spent much of his time on the island dictating his memoirs, which in a sense was to establish his own version of his career, including why, for example, he never actually lost a battle. It was the incompetent marshals who served him who lost the battles. For example, Marshal Ney at Waterloo, whom he described as une pauvre tête, a blockhead. But anyway, so I think to understand Napoleon, you need to study his time at St. Helena. So let me go straight on to it and tell you the story. After the disastrous Battle of Waterloo, where the French army disintegrated, Napoleon rushed back to Paris, tried to persuade the interim government to let him form a new army and fight on. But the interim government said, not on your life, you've caused enough death and destruction. We want you to go off to the United States, or to America as it was. And they suggested that he should get out of Paris, go to the West Coast, to Rochefort, where with a bit of luck, there would be a French frigate waiting to take him over to America. Well, after a good deal of hesitation in Paris and at the Malmaison, the house of his former wife, Josephine, he went to Rochefort, and with quite a large retinue of supporters, and after again a good deal of hesitation and debate, he settled on a little island at Rochefort called the Ile d'Aix, a fortified island, and finally decided to hand himself over to a British man of war. There was a French frigate, but the captain was actually not very keen on taking him to America. But by this time, the British had blockaded Rochefort, and Her Majesty's ship, the Bellerophon, known to the Matelots as the Billy Ruffian, took him on board and brought him over to Torbay and to Plymouth with his entourage. He had 3 marshals, 2 of them had wives, a civilian of equal status, and a whole retinue of valets and servants and cooks and so on. So off he came over to Plymouth, while the British government under Lord Liverpool decided what to do with him. And finally, on the advice of a civil servant from the Admiralty, they decided to send him to St. Helena, as being the most remote place they could think of from which it would be so difficult to escape. So, in a sense, Napoleon and his entourage were dragged kicking and screaming to another of Her Majesty's ships, the Northumberland, and off they set on the several weeks' journey to St. Helena. They were in charge of Admiral Cockburn, who was in charge of the Northumberland and the flotilla with it. The flotilla actually, believe it or not, had about 2,000 British troops, 2,000 redcoats, who were sent out with the Admiral to make sure that Napoleon on St. Helena would not escape. And since the population of the island at the time was not much more than 4,000, it really was a massive influx into the island. Well, Napoleon arrived in October 1815, and after an initial stay at a little house called the Briars, where he spent his time amusing himself, as you've heard, with the 15-year-old Betsy Balcombe, they were finally installed in the house called Longwood, which you can now visit on the island. It was a pretty poor house, really an old farmhouse, which had been redeveloped and improved to take this entourage. There were 30 or 40 of them. Napoleon, the three generals, the senior civilian, and this whole retinue of valets and servants and equerries and so on. And they were subject on the island to very strict security indeed. Napoleon was free to wander in the not inconsiderable gardens of Longwood House, but if he went beyond them, he had to be accompanied by a British officer to make quite sure that he didn't escape, although in practice there was very little chance that he could possibly escape from that island. And every night, the sentries moved in. You had a redcoat every 10 meters or so, standing even at the windows of the house with fixed rifle and fixed bayonet to make sure that the ogre could not escape, as he had done the previous year from the island of Elba. Now, a critical moment arrived. Napoleon arrived in mid-October 1815. The government in London had chosen Lieutenant General Sir Hudson Lowe to be the governor. And he didn't arrive until April in 1816. Now, Hudson Lowe, who's been much criticized, was not an outstanding soldier, but he'd had a pretty respectable career. He'd earned the commendation of Marshal Blucher, who saved the day at Waterloo with Wellington, and of General Sir John Moore, the great British general who died at the Battle of Corunna. He'd got a pretty good record, but I think he was appointed because he was a good soldier and he did what he was told. He carried out his orders. And that's what the British government wanted there. They wanted someone who would carry out their orders and not let Napoleon escape. But alas, from the arrival of Sir Hudson Lowe in April 1816, the whole situation deteriorated. On the day after he arrived, Hudson Lowe decided to go and call on his prisoner. And off he went with the Admiral in tow and his ADCs, and wearing his plumed helmet and his scarlet tunic, the commander-in-chief and governor of the island. And he went on to Longwood House and demanded to see Napoleon. And somebody came out, one of Napoleon's party came out and said, "I'm terribly sorry, the emperor's having a bath and he can't see you. And in any case, you know, emperors don't see people in the morning and without an appointment. So could you go away and make an appointment to see him some other time?" Well, I think in modern parlance, apart from being humiliated in front of his own supporters, Hudson Lowe was absolutely gobsmacked. I mean, to think Napoleon was his prisoner and said he couldn't see him. Anyway, Hudson Lowe swallowed his pride, made an appointment for the next day and went to see Napoleon, and they had a reasonably polite discussion and meeting. But from then on, it went downhill. And it really is astonishing that although Napoleon was on the island for 5.5 years, and Hudson Lowe for nearly 5 of those years, they only had 6 meetings together between the first occasion in April and a final meeting towards the end of August in 1816. And Hudson Lowe never actually came face to face with Napoleon till he saw him in his coffin on the 5th of May in 1821. They had 6 meetings which got more and more unpleasant. Napoleon couldn't stand the sight of this man, Hudson Lowe, and although at the first meeting he was reasonably polite, he became more insulting. They argued. Hudson Lowe tried to maintain his temper, but he found it impossible to raise with Napoleon any of the issues that he felt it was his duty as governor to raise. Napoleon would not discuss the question of how much money he could spend because there was very strict control by the Treasury. As a former Treasury official, of course, I approve of that very highly, but Napoleon was not so keen on it. He wouldn't discuss the possibility or the proposal for building a better house. Longwood was not a good residence for Napoleon. It was damp, it was rat infested, it was termite infested, and nearly all the entourage were crowded in cheek by jowl in this one house. And they were a quarrelsome, very quarrelsome lot. It was very difficult for Napoleon to control them. And of course, it was an utter humiliation. Here was this giant, whatever you think of him, this giant figure who'd commanded Europe, who'd commanded massive armies, before whom even the Pope bowed down. I mean, Napoleon actually crowned himself in 1805 with the Pope looking on. And here he was, in this miserable house, Longwood, with 30 or 40 people quarreling and disputing their role. And he was desperately keen to maintain his imperial image. And he couldn't stand the governor, who was his jailer. One of the things that was of the greatest friction between them, which is almost farcical, is that the governor, who felt absolutely bound to obey his very strict instructions from London, the governor was instructed to call Napoleon General Bonaparte, and not the emperor. And Napoleon could not stand this. And it got to the ridiculous situation, for example, when Napoleon might send a letter to the governor. He never signed it himself. One of the generals would do it on his behalf. So the governor might receive a letter saying, Your Excellency, His Majesty the Emperor instructs me to inform you, and so on and so forth. And the governor would send it back saying, sorry, we don't know of any emperor. We don't know of any emperor on this island. Equally, when the governor sent a letter to Napoleon at Longwood addressed to General Bonaparte, it was returned to the governor with a little reply saying, sorry, no one of that name known at this address. But can you imagine how this sort of thing festered and increased the antipathy between these two people? And finally, in August of 1816, Napoleon said, I will not see that man again. Never let him come near me, and tell him I've got a couple of pistols loaded. So if he tries to get in here, he'll have to watch it. So the relationship broke down in the first year. The rest of Napoleon's time was, in a sense, one of progressive psychological and physical deterioration. He was initially, I think, quite fit when he went to St. Helena, but his physical condition deteriorated. And I think there came a point where, although he had initially hoped that the British government and the Allies would relent and allow him to leave the island, go back to Europe, I think it began to dawn on him that there was no escape. He was there for good. He was going to die on the island, and his health suffered. He refused to take exercise. He was unwilling to go out if he had to be accompanied by a British officer. So he put on weight, he got fat, his legs swelled, his gums bled. and he became seriously ill progressively as time went on. And of course, the doctors were absolutely useless. They had no idea what was wrong with him. The standard remedy was to bleed him or to give him emetics, give him mercury, and so on, which I think probably made his condition worse. So during the last year, although my views, as you will detect, tend to go towards Hudson Lowe rather than to Napoleon, I do feel huge personal sympathy with this great figure who had suffered this catastrophic decline and who was becoming very seriously ill. And during the last year, he deteriorated, and finally, in May, on the 5th of May, Napoleon died. His last words were said to be, "France, mon fils, l'armée, Joséphine," the 5 things that he loved. And he passed away with not all his companions. Some of them had actually left before him, but for the faithful companions, 2 of the generals and the most faithful retainers were round his bed as he died. And he was buried in a little valley called Geranium Valley on the island. You can visit it now. It's a beautiful spot. Napoleon wanted to be buried by the banks of the Seine in the country that he loved, near Paris. But the governor was instructed to bury him on St. Helena. And they made a very, very thorough job of it. He was actually buried in 4 coffins. I think there was 1 lead, 2 mahogany, and the one he was actually inside was some sort of tin plate. I think the governor was absolutely determined that even though he was dead, he would not escape again, as he had done at Elba. So he was buried with the grandest funeral that was possible on St. Helena, with all the military turning out, full military honors, the coffin carried on the shoulders of grenadier guards, and so on. Later, in 1840, he was exhumed and taken back to Paris, but that's another story. Now, Napoleon died. There are all sorts of theories and conspiracy theories about Napoleon's death. One of the favorites is to say that he died from arsenic poisoning, but without going into it, I can assure you that the general belief of historians and what I firmly believe myself is that he died of stomach cancer. I think the autopsy that was carried out on the island by his own doctor, a Frenchman sent out to look after him, demonstrated that he had cancer of the stomach, which it said that his father died of before him. So Napoleon died in a very, very pitiable state at the end, physically and psychologically broken. And there is a great debate, I think the debate I had a couple of weeks ago with the historian Andrew Roberts, about how far the governor was culpable and how well Napoleon behaved and so on. And you have to make your own mind up when you read the story. I think the governor, although he was no paragon, and I think with a bit more common sense, could have, I think, overcome some of the differences between them. He was always going back, a bit like a very bad ambassador or high commissioner, always going back to London for instructions instead of making up his own mind and getting on with it. But I don't think the governor deserves the blame that many put on him for his conduct. And if I may just quote, at the time of the funeral, when Napoleon died, the governor said, "He was England's greatest enemy and mine too, but I forgive him everything. On the death of a great man like him, we should only feel deep concern and regret." So although the governor wasn't a paragon, and he might have been a bit of an ass in the way he treated Napoleon, he certainly wasn't a vindictive ass. Well, I hope that's given you some flavor of what I think the very, very dramatic story of Napoleon's captivity on St. Helena, which in the thousands of biographies of Napoleon is seldom fully treated. It's usually a coda at the end of the story, but I think it's a story that deserves very, very much more attention if you are to really understand the psychology of the Emperor Napoleon. Thank you very much indeed for asking me.
Thank you, Sir Brian. That was fascinating.
Je les remets, j'espère que ça va le faire. Je les ai reset dans la boîte. Oui, ça a l'air bon.
Sorry, I missed that. I think I was muted for a moment.
I don't think they were intending to speak.
Sorry, I've finished, isn't it now to Michael?
You have, Brian. Yes, thank you. I'm just seeing if Michael's unmute.
Yes, sorry, I'm unmuted
now.
You suddenly disappeared off the screen, but there we are. Thank you very much, Lucia. And I will now talk about St. Helena, the island, which in most people's mind is only known for one thing, and that is, of course, Napoleon. And if you ask most people where St. Helena is, they have absolutely no idea, except they say it's sort of far away somewhere. Well, indeed, it is very far away. It is the second most remote inhabited island in the world after Tristan da Cunha. It's even more remote than Easter Island. It's 1,200 miles off the coast of Angola, about 1/3 of the distance between Angola and Brazil. And it was only discovered by the Portuguese in about the 1590s or so. And it was discovered and kept secret by the Portuguese. They discovered it by chance, because of course for them, with their possessions in Asia and India, it was an extremely useful place to refuel in secret and to get fresh water, to rest some sailors, change the crew and all that. The British stumbled upon it some years later and took command and captured it. It was briefly recaptured by the Dutch, but it has been a British possession since about 1640 or so, and it is the second oldest colony after Bermuda. I mean, much older than India, than South Africa, than any of the other larger places on the route. But it was for Britain an absolutely vital trade route, or rather refueling route, for the trading ships that came from India. Well, all the ships, because in those days when Britain didn't have control of South Africa, they needed somewhere, the ships needed somewhere to put in for port to, as the Portuguese did, to refresh, refuel, stock up with fruit and all that. And by chance, or at least by a happy chance, the winds from South Africa blow any ship almost directly straight to St. Helena. So it was very easy to get to. You would be blown there if you came round the Cape of Good Hope. It then saw its heyday when it was very, very important for all the ships trading backwards and forwards from the east. In its heyday, perhaps in the 1750s or so, it was see 3 ships a day calling in there, more than 1,000 ships a year. Of course, since the opening of the Suez Canal, all of a sudden it became virtually irrelevant in terms of shipping. And for some years after that, there was a slow decline in traffic. The ships to and from South Africa, from Britain, used to call in, and people enjoyed that very much because tourists and passengers and others would have 6 or 7 hours ashore where they would quickly look at Jamestown, climb the famous Jacob's Ladder that I see in the background of Tony Williams's picture there, the 699 step ladder, as it were, stone ladder going up from the capital to the town at the top of the cliff there, right above Jamestown. And that was then, St. Helena was still sort of in people's consciousness, but it slowly basically disappeared into nowhere because after a while, no ships called there at all. And the island was dependent on a supply ship that plied backwards and forwards from South Africa, about 5 days' journey. And unfortunately, the island was in long and slow decline, both economically and in every other way. The standard of living on the island is pretty low. £8,600 a year is the average salary. And so many things have to be imported. Almost anything that is manufactured has to come from overseas. And it is an extremely expensive British overseas territory to maintain. And Britain has decided, or decided about 10 or 15 years ago, that the answer is to try to make the island more accessible. And the answer, therefore, is to build an airport. Well, that was easier said than done. It is a very steep and mountainous island, spectacular scenery, and the scenery varies from subtropical barren mountains to lush green valleys just in the space of a mile or so. And there's very little flat ground. The only flat ground there is the habitat of one of the unique species, the wirebird, which they were keen to preserve. St. Helena, having been so remote for so long, has developed a large number of unique species, fauna, flora. I mean, some not very spectacular things. I mean, there's a hairy woodlouse, which people go raving on about, and there's a she cabbage and a he cabbage, which are kind of tree, which if you find them very exciting, then they're there. But there are unique species there, and people are dedicated to preserving them, and therefore they couldn't build the airport on the habitat of the wirebird, which is actually a rather dull-looking bird, rather like a sparrow. They decided to build it on the cliff top. And unfortunately, it turns out that nobody in the Department for DFI, the Department for Overseas Development, did any actual measurement of the wind currents, so the wind speeds. And they built this magnificent airport, very well built by a South African company, extremely nicely designed. And they then brought in the first plane, and the first plane practically crashed. I mean, it tried to come in, a Boeing 737, it made 3 attempts to land. It did, in the end, land successfully. But what they hadn't anticipated was that there was wind shear. I mean, a number of islands have wind shear. Madeira is another one, which has a dangerous airport because you get strong currents blowing off the sea onto the airport, and of course, it's unpredictable. They have now managed to not exactly fix it, but they've got extremely sophisticated wind measuring instruments now on the island. For the first year or so, it was more or less out of use, and that provoked a tremendous amount of derision and blame, and people bad-mouthing Department for International Development and also everybody else for not actually thinking about how this airport should be used. They did find that smaller planes actually weren't so affected. So for the past 2 years or so, they have been using the Embraer Brazilian-built planes that can seat about 90. They're not that small, and they do a shuttle service from South Africa. They have now, during this period of COVID, when St. Helena has been virtually cut off because they have had no cases of COVID at all. And to keep that, the happy situation like that, there's very, very strict quarantine. And nobody is allowed in without quarantining. Somebody did come back, I noticed last week in the local newspaper, somebody was fined £2,000 for putting their dustbin a few yards outside the place they should put it when they were in quarantine after arriving back again. But it has kept them safe. But of course, for saints, as the St. Helenians are known, it's meant that they can't actually go anywhere for the moment or get home, especially as South Africa, which is the staging post, is itself racked by a very serious COVID situation. So they have been chartering planes every 6 weeks from London, and they have found that they can actually bring in Boeing 737 or 727s without too much difficulty. It's just a question of pilot knowledge and skill. So it is still reachable. And the ultimate aim is that tourists will finally start arriving. And Napoleon, of course, is absolutely key to that. Since it's the only thing anybody knows about the island, the saints have finally embraced Napoleon after, I would say, 190 years. For most of the time, most people in St. Helena just thought that Napoleon was somebody dumped on them, which indeed he was. and they had very little interest in him, and they really didn't care what happened to his monuments, or I mean the fortifications, or to his memory, or to anything. Partly because the responsibility was placed entirely on France. Queen Victoria was very keen to establish nice relations with the Bourbons, and she agreed that they could take the body back. So they sent an expedition out in 1840. He was dug up, the coffin was opened, they said it miraculous state of preservation, not a single hair moved or any decay sign or signal of decay, taken back to France, buried at Les Invalides, and from then on, his house and where his tomb had been in Geranium Dell were given to France in perpetuity as French territory. So actually that little bit, a tiny little bit of a very tiny island, which itself is only 10 miles by 6, is French territory. And there is an honorary French consul there who looks after the house and looks after everything to do with Napoleon. And that's why the St. Helena government has always really felt that, well, Napoleon's nothing to do with them. But now they do feel that they need the tourism, partly and particularly because Britain's Department of International Development has said that having spent £250 million on an airport to serve 4,500 people, which is quite a high cost per head, that they're not going to keep the subsidy up at the rate they have been, and it will gradually be reduced. And St. Helena must sink or swim on its own efforts to attract tourism, which is what essentially they're doing, and which is partly the reason for the British Bicentenary Napoleonic Trust, in order to make the island better known so that people can go out and can visit. And indeed they can, and they can have a magnificent experience because, again, finally, after a very long time, the government of the local government, the St. Helena government, plucked up courage and found the money to build a very good hotel. There was a not very good hotel and one or two quite nice sort of bed and breakfast places, but there had never been a sort of 4-star hotel on the island. And without that, of course, the kind of tourists they were trying to attract would not come. And it's just unfortunate that, of course, now there's this at least a year's delay before any numbers start appearing people can start appearing in any great number. But I led 2 expeditions sponsored by the Times of people who wanted to go to the island. And we went to South Africa first. They had a great time. I have to say, it is a bit hit and miss. The first time, none of us were able to actually get there because the island was beset by storms and fog and that kind of thing. So the airport was shut. So after a fruitless attempt to fly there via Angola, via Namibia, we had to turn around and go back again. So the first trip never actually got there. But the aim is, if you are willing to risk a slight possibility that the plane might not get there, you will find that you can get there's a flight once a week, and you can have a magnificent time on the island. Many people used to go there by the old ship, which was extremely agreeable and pleasant, but it took a very long time. It's 5 days out from South Africa. Then, of course, it goes on to various other places. The ship went on to Ascension sometimes, and that's another 3 days on to Ascension Island, and then back again to St. Helena, and then back again to South Africa. And really, a round trip was not much less than 3 weeks. Now, St. Helena's spent ages trying to diversify its economy. I mean, the economy basically consists of potatoes and eggs and some coffee and a few local industries and not very much more. There really isn't much to do. And somebody had the bright idea, why don't we set up St. Helena as a call center? Because everyone speaks English. There's a pretty good standard of education there. It's on Greenwich Mean Time, so it's right in the right time zone. And it would work very well as a call center for all these places, as does India, other places. And they got a company ready to set it up. And then they said, well, when we need to go and inspect how things are going, which airport do we use? And when do we get there? And they said, well, there isn't an airport. They said, oh, well, how do we get there? They said, well, you go by ship. They said, well, how long does that take? They said, well, it's about 3 weeks there and back. They said, 3 weeks? We're never setting up a call center there. So I'm afraid that sort of idea has gone out of the window. And that is the trouble. Being so remote, it's very difficult now to think of anything that can bring the island into closer proximity. There is, however, a very important project going on, which is to bring fiber optic cable to St. Helena, because at the moment, without that, all communications are via satellite, and until recently, there wasn't even television. They've now got television. You can get access to satellite-based or satellite television, and indeed, they've only just set up a mobile phone system. But because it's based via satellite, it's not secure. So anything that demands secure communications, particularly, for example, in banking, will have to wait till they can get a loop built in one of the Atlantic cables that will go via St. Helena and connect them further to the outside world, which they hope will be within a year or so. So there is hope that the economy will prosper and flourish. It's still pretty difficult to see how the island can get much beyond cottage industries. Fishing is an important aspect. Tuna fish, very profitable, plenty of tuna around there. Large conservation zones have been set up around St. Helena. Climate, very favorable. And those sort of things could work. The other thing that I was myself trying to set up there was a micro tannery, because people don't realize that tuna skins are some of the most valuable leather you could get. Extremely fashionable, very smooth, enormous creatures. You could set up a micro tannery that could do tuna skins, which then in turn could be used for making fashionable articles or knickknacks or anything that could be sold to tourists and all that. But it's just the mechanics of getting an industry set up somewhere so remote is quite tricky. So there have been a number of proposals, but not very many successes. So many saints who've got any kind of get up and go in them have unfortunately got up and gone. And very many of them went to the Falklands because there was a huge demand for labor in the Falklands. And funnily enough, they seem pretty remote to us, but for the saints, it's one of the easiest places to get to because they just needed to take a ship to Ascension. And on Ascension, you can pick up the twice weekly RAF flights that go down to the Falklands to keep the base supplied and rotate the troops there. So many saints could get up to Ascension, pick up the flight there, and work in the Falklands. And at least 500 have done so. Another place where they could go and have gone is, I mean, it sounds very bizarre, but they've gone to Swindon. And you will find very many saints in Swindon. And many people think, well, why on earth have they gone there? And there's a fairly simple answer, and that is because the RAF flight that comes via Ascension lands at Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire. And the nearest large town to Bryce Norton is Swindon. And many people arrived in Britain and went to a local town and set up there. And in fact, there's a community of more than 1,000. And in fact, the local MP has to take into account issues in St. Helena if he wants to, have some influence with some of the voters in Swindon. But there have been communities set up. Saints are great travelers. Once they get up and leave, they do travel around, and many are successful. And the hope is that as the island improves and as the economy improves, many will go back. And the great hope is that the Napoleon-based tourism or ecological tourism to look at the unique species will be something that will attract more and more people. It's high-end tourism. It's never going to be bucket and spade tourism. As you can see in that, if you're looking at that picture of the Jacob's Ladder and the bay down at the bottom, Jamestown, there is that is the only basic sort of shoreline that there is where the island doesn't end in steep cliffs going straight down into the sea. It is an extremely rugged and inhospitable landscape, very beautiful, very lovely, but not one that is for bucket and spade holidays. It's also a place where history dominates. Napoleon was not the only exile there. In fact, by no means the last. In 1900, they had up to 3,000 Boer prisoners of war who were shipped out to the island during the Boer War and spent 3 years on a campsite there Unfortunately, they were ravaged by various plagues that swept through the camp. 2 camps there were, and there's a large Boer cemetery of more than 100 people who are buried on the island. And then even as late as 1960, there were 3 Bahraini civil rights activists whom the Bahraini Sultan had no time for and wanted them shipped out by the British, who were nominally sort of in charge of Bahrain. And they were indeed shipped out at his request and shipped out to St. Helena for 3 years of exile. And that was pretty much a scandal. First of all, these 3 people, all they'd done is ask for a written constitution. When they protested, the Sultan put them on trial, but the jury had 3 of his own relatives. It was held in a village far away from where these people lived, and the verdict was announced 5 days before the trial began. So it didn't look as though it was a fair trial. And when these questions were raised in Parliament about why Britain had agreed to imprison these 3 prisoners from a territory over which British had nominal control, in the end, they were released. But they had been kept in one of the fortresses that had been used to house the troops who guarded Napoleon. And they were the last of the exiles. And after that, although it is extremely remote, they've never had any more prisoners sent out there. And I think most of them are heartily glad about that. Well, that's just a quick run around the island. A fascinating place. I hugely recommend a trip there. Not cheap to get there, but worth it once you do.
Well done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. Obviously, I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak about Napoleon several times, but each time I hear you speak, Michael, I do learn something new. So thank you for keeping it, different on each occasion, which is great. And so ladies and gentlemen, we're now open to questions. So if you do have any questions for our 3 excellent panelists, you can either post it in the chat, which me and Lucia will keep an eye on, or if you want to raise your hand, and I will then ask you to unmute. So yes, on this very important 200th anniversary of Napoleon's death, we're now open for questions. Lucia, I think to start off, we will just selfishly going to ask you to ask your first question, Lucia. So
yeah, sure. So it was for Michael. 2 questions. The first one is, where in Namibia do you fly from to get to St. Helena? That's posed from one of our committee members. And for me personally, you mentioned that there have been no COVID cases in St. Helena. So could you just say a bit about what their vaccine program has been, and if everyone has been vaccinated already?
They've done very well with the vaccine program. They're well over 50% already. I think it's up to 60%. If you look at these tables they publish of vaccination rates in various places, countries and territories, you will find that some of the British overseas territories, because they're very small, they've got some of the highest rates of vaccination anywhere in the world. And St. Helena has been very effective at that. They've had it, it was shipped out, the vaccines were shipped out or flown out right at the start. Well, when at the same time that Britain began. They have still had, nevertheless, extremely strict quarantine regulations. There is talk of trying to loosen these, just as there is in Britain, but at the moment, it's absolutely not clear when or how restrictions will be lifted. So I don't advise a trip right this minute. I mean, I would wait a few weeks to see when it's slightly easier to go. As for how you get there, well, the normal route, it's a South African Airways subsidiary, which flies once a week, or in busy peak times when saints are returning home, they put on a second flight twice a week, and it goes from Johannesburg. It calls in at Windhoek in Namibia. And the reason it calls in is it might be theoretically possible to fly the whole way. It's about 6 hours flying, so it's not impossible to fly there, but any plane going to St. Helena must take a massive amount of fuel, because if there's ever a problem, if the plane develops a problem, or if the airport for some reason is shut, there's fog or there's bad weather or something happens, There's nowhere else to go. You can't divert to anywhere. What they were hoping was that they could divert to Ascension Island. But the Americans sit on Ascension Island and are extremely jealous about the runway that they control, that they've leased. It's a British island, but nevertheless, the Americans have been very strict and selfish, I have to say, about saying no one else can use this runway. So that means that any plane in trouble has to go all the way back to Africa. So you need enough fuel to build up to go there and back. That's why all planes have to land at Windhoek. But unfortunately, the Namibians have not allowed boarding rights there, which many people thought would be ideal, as there's connection straight to Germany from Windhoek and various other places where you could come and bring tourists in. But I'm afraid at the moment, until they negotiate a new air agreement, you can only get there via South Africa.
Thank you, Michael. I think we've now got a question. August, you have your hand up. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi guys. Hey, I just wanted to point out on the last thing, there was just an update a couple of hours ago from the St. Helena government to say 95% of the population has now got 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. I thought I'd just throw that one out there. Well,
95 is pretty good. Yes, that's well, heartening to be updated and to be updated with such positive news.
Yes, yeah, that's very good news. Because the take-up across the UK overseas territories has varied dramatically. Although I do believe Gibraltar is number one for the take-up of a vaccine. Okay, no, we've had another question from David Adam. Again, probably for yourself, Michael, on this one. Are there any plans for flights to St. Helena from Britain?
Well, there are plans for charter flights, and they may continue. At the moment, these are sort of on demand when saints who've come to Britain or people need to visit family want to go there. And it rather depends on how many people they can get to fill the plane. It's not cheap. I asked today about the possibility of this. So far, in the past year, I think it's about once every 6 weeks they go from Stansted. It's a charter company, and the airfare is about £950 there and back. But there are direct flights, and this is very heartening news, because when they built the airport, they thought originally there could be direct flights. There would be a route London, Madrid, St. Helena, South Africa, or Cape Town. The reason being that from London, you get people going directly to the island, as many saints and many British would like to do. Madrid, they would refuel, but also you would pick up tourists from Europe at Madrid. Then you go to the island itself, and then from there you go on to South Africa, because very many saints go to South Africa for things like hospital treatment or even education or important business or shopping or whatever. So there would be a traffic on all those 4 bits of the route. Well, that never came about. They never could make it viable. But if they found now that there are enough people going directly from London to the island, then that might continue. It's a bit, at the moment, sort of, it's not laid down. I think you would have to ask the St. Helena government representative, who could tell you how and where you might pick up one of these flights. But certainly the precedent has been set that they are possible.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. And then we've had a question from Gus Eldridge. Gus asks, probably directed towards Sir Brian to answer this. What was the diet like back in Napoleon's time on the island? Was it a varied, like, what did they eat essentially? Or yeah, can you say much about the food, and did that hasten Napoleon's death or not?
I don't, on the island itself, meat was very short. And in fact, there was a prohibition on killing cattle or any animals. But at Longwood House, despite the crowding and the coming down of Napoleon, in a sense, they lived the life of Riley. They had plenty of everything. They had enormous quantities of wine. I think research has shown that every quarter, while Napoleon was there, they had something like 3,000 bottles of champagne and wine. And I think a black market was going on. I think a lot of it was sold at the back door of Longwood. But Napoleon only spent a very short time at his meals. And being the emperor, they met in great state every night, in full dress uniform. No one could sit down until the emperor sat down. And when the emperor finished eating, they all had to stop. But they did extremely well. He had his chefs from France with him, plenty of wine, plenty of meat. I think there was great resentment on the island that while, for example, water was short, but Napoleon had baths every day. In fact, he spent hours and hours in the bath, particularly as he got weaker and weaker and sicker. He used to lie in the bath, hold meetings in the bath, discuss and read in the bath. And there was great resentment that while the poor squaddies, the 2,000 squaddies who were camped out on Deadwood Plain were short of water and short of other things, they were living it up at Longwood. So I don't think there was any problem with his diet, although I mean it may in general terms have not been a particularly healthy one. But Napoleon himself initially took quite a lot of exercise. He was free to go around the considerable gardens of Longwood. He was free to go out on horseback outside Longwood as long as he was accompanied by a British officer. But as time went on, partly because he hated being accompanied by a British officer, he took less and less exercise. So probably it wasn't the best diet with a great deal of wine and a great deal of meat, but there was plenty at Longwood.
Can I just add a postscript about the bath? The French consul, who's been there for a very long time, extremely dedicated to the preservation and memory of Napoleon, and really almost single-handedly has restored a lot of Longwood, because after Napoleon's death, it was turned back into a farmhouse, and many of the things that were there were basically just sold off, and various collectors and people who thought, oh, I'd like something, you know, that was once at Longwood, including the bath, the tin bath that he used to sit in when his stomach cancer was really getting to him, that disappeared to America. And it was been in America for more than 100 years, and the French consul tracked it down and found who had Napoleon's bath and put in a bid and brought it back. So many of the things in the house, having been scattered all over the place, have been reassembled back in the state, and the house now looks exactly, or almost exactly, as it did on the day when Napoleon died.
Wow.
Can I just add to that what Michael has said? That I have to confess one of the great sins of my life. When I went round Longwood House, when I went out there researching on my book, when no one was looking, I actually climbed in the bath. A very great thrill.
Oh, I was looking.
My wife was there and looking, but she didn't actually squeal on me.
The key question is, Sir Brian, did you fill it with hot water?
No, but Napoleon did. Again, there was great resentment that he could, a bit like Churchill, actually. He would read and dictate.
I have to say, Sir Brian, I was just thinking of that comparison because I know Winston Churchill was into dictating from the bath.
That's right.
During the war. So it seems to be a thing for great leaders to enjoy soak and dictate.
His first valet, Marchand, whose memoirs are a tremendous insight into life on the island, Marchand made him a little sort of a little rack across the bath, which fitted on both sides, so he could put papers and books on this while he was having a bath. But in the last year or so of his life, he spent most of his time either in bed or in the bath.
Right. Wow. So we've had another question. We've had quite several, but we'll just probably only have time for 2 or 3 more. So we've had a question from Robert Midgley. Did the French personnel stay on St. Helena after Napoleon's death?
No, the answer. 2 of the generals, one, General Gourgaud, who was a very quarrelsome and troublesome man, a prickly porcupine, I think, as Lord Rosebery described him in his account of St. Helena. He left the island halfway through. The Emmanuel de Lascars, one of the 4 who wasn't a general, but was a very senior civilian, a conseiller d'etat, he was thrown out by the governor after a year or 18 months. The others stuck it to the end. General Bertrand, and the two valleys, Marchand and Arlay, but they all left very quickly after Napoleon's death.
Right, thank you. And then we've had a question from Will. Will asks, is there a way to get more involved with Napoleon 200 for like the general public?
I think that's for James.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. So the bicentenary events today are not the end of Napoleon 200. As people might know, we had planned to have a public event today for some time, and then of course that wasn't possible because of COVID. So unfortunately, all of our events had to go online. So we streamed the commemorative events on St. Helena, and then we also yesterday screened a series of short videos showing people laying plaques at the graves of those individuals, many of whom we've talked about this evening, who shared Napoleon's final years on St. Helena, and who are buried in the UK. So that there are 6 individuals who we commemorated, 4 of whom are buried at Kensal Green, 1 of whom is buried at St. Mary's Paddington, and 1 of whom is buried at St. Mark's Mayfair. And that includes Betsy Balcombe, Gorica, Sir Hudson Lowe, Barry Amara, so many of the individuals we've talked about tonight. And you can see those videos again on our website if you're interested, and there are reenactors reading in character as those individuals. Beyond May, because we weren't able to have a public event, we are considering what else we could do this year. We're thinking of having an event in July, though whether or not that will be open to the public, we're not clear on currently, because again, it depends on events. But what I would just say is please do register for updates on our website. Please do keep an eye on social media and the website. And I hope that we can deliver some other activities and events this year to continue the bicentenary beyond May. Because we haven't been able to deliver what we had hoped to do in May.
Thank you, James. And just on that note, please, if there's anything we can do to promote future events, please do let us know. We'd be very happy to do that.
That would be great.
Also, we've had a question from Guy Hale. Guy asks, do you know if the French government is doing much to celebrate this historic anniversary?
Well, yes. So today, President Macron, I believe, gave a speech and laid a wreath at the tomb at Les Invalides. I haven't seen the photos of that or read the speech, which I think is, I think in his speech he was trying to sort of confront the issue of what Napoleon means in the 21st century and his legacy and some of the controversial aspects related to Napoleon. So I'll be interested to read that. I presume it'll be in the papers tomorrow. And of course, the events on St. Helena at the empty tomb were organised by the French consul on the island. So they were organised by the French authorities. And I think the Fondation Napoleon and the French authorities do have some additional events over the coming days as well. If you have a look at the Fondation Napoleon website, there'll be details of those.
Brilliant.
I could just add that there has been considerable controversy in France as to how they should commemorate Napoleon, because if it had been 30 years ago, there would have been no question, but it would be a huge heroic celebration of, the nation's most famous son and La Gloire and all that. And since then, and particularly recently, there have been questions asked about, was it really right to rampage all over Europe and subject other nations to his rule? And did he not reinstate slavery in Haiti, which he did? And was he really such a noble and great character? So they've been beset by the same questioning over their great hero as some of the questioning, for example, that we've seen about Churchill's record recently. And that has made it a bit more difficult for them to have an open, out-and-out celebration of him today.
Can I just point out that one of the things that Hudson Lowe did, the much maligned governor, the bourreau, the torturer, as the French put it, he actually abolished slavery on St. Helena, in contrast to Napoleon's record.
That's an interesting fact. No, didn't know. Was not aware of that, Sir Brian. But I was just going to ask that we have had a question from Oliver, which kind of leads into the point I suppose you've just raised, Michael. Is do the panelists, and this is open to each of you to answer, do you feel that we're undergoing a revisionist look now because of more recent events in our lifetime on Napoleon?
Well, I'm very
period?
against revisionism in history. I mean, pulling down statues doesn't change history. I mean, you might perhaps question other aspects that have been overlooked. And for example, Churchill or something, I mean, the fact is that he had a disastrous record in a whole lot of areas as, well, even as Secretary of the Admiralty, I mean, Gallipoli and things, which were overlooked in recent years because of the great Second World War triumph. And I think all historical characters are subject to some revision and correction. And I think that's right. And Napoleon, no less than anyone else. And I'm sure, well, it's more for the French to do the reassessment, because Britain has always thought that old Boney was, a bit of a bad one. And that's why we've been quite keen to emphasize that the British Napoleonic Trust, we're not celebrating Napoleon, we're commemorating Napoleon. You ask a Brit, shall we raise cheers for Napoleon? People say, are you mad? Do you know what he did? It's commemorating somebody who made a huge difference in European history.
I think we go back to what I quoted, Hudson Lowe said of Napoleon, he was England's greatest enemy, and mine too, but I forgive him everything. The death of a great man, we should only feel deep concern and regret.
Yep. And I think we'll just take one more question, which I will ask. Again, it's from Gus, but Gus asks, had the Battle of Trafalgar gone the other way, would we all be speaking French today as our main language?
Probably, don't they mean the Battle of Waterloo?
Well, Trafalgar in a sense, had Trafalgar gone the other way, I suppose, meaning would have Napoleon successfully then invaded England and we would be part of a French empire?
I don't know. That was one battle. I think the Royal Navy would still have had command of the Channel.
Okay.
And I mean, Napoleon waited months with 100,000 troops at Boulogne and a whole fleet of landing crafts ready to cross the Channel, but he never made it. I don't think losing the Trafalgar would have made all that much difference.
You think that, so that like the Channel's always been our greatest defence, Sir Brian, in the sense
I mean, it was the Royal Navy, secondly the weather.
Okay, I suppose, but leading on to that, it's a good point. I mean, so yes, Waterloo though. I suppose, Michael, what do you, and James, do you have any thoughts if things did?
Well, Waterloo was a single set encounter, a very bloody one, a very big one, and in the end, a very decisive one. But the fact is that Napoleon had a massive array of people lined up against him. It wasn't just Wellington. Of course, the Prussians and various others were against him. And not all the French were, rallied to his side. I mean, the great army that he managed to get together after escaping from Elba. So if he had won Waterloo, I think it would have been the final victory. And certainly, I think it would have been difficult for him to re-establish his position, and certainly no easier to invade Britain at all.
On the Eastern Front, you see the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians were closing in. I mean, he maybe would have fought another battle or two, but I think the defeat was inexorable.
Right. Yes. So was the Prussians arriving late decisive or not in your?
I think the fact that they arrived at all was decisive.
Okay. Yes. Very good. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we have overrun slightly, but it's been well worth it. Thank you to everyone who's asked questions. I say, if just to bit of housekeeping, just to announce, our next event, we're looking at doing a Cayman Islands themed event in June. There's been a recent general election in the Cayman Islands. And we're looking to have a few panelists to talk about the results from that election. And then I'm pleased to announce, ladies and gentlemen, that we are, after 18 months, set to host our first physical event in July on the 13th of July, we are hosting a summer barbecue in central London. So if you would like to come to that, and it's particularly please to our excellent speakers, James, Sir Brian and Michael, we'd love to have you if you are able to get to London. And we do also, we do a charity, we've done this event format before. We are also hosting the Friends of Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands Association. So it's a really good event and a great, obviously, opportunity to see people in 3D, not just 2D. Yes, I do put that in your diary. And obviously, as always, we do promote our Fotbot. We still got a few hundred books of Stuart McPherson's BBC 4 book on the overseas territories. So do head to our online shop if you want to purchase a copy. We do also have various of items, ties, cufflinks, DVDs, if you still own a DVD player. But otherwise, just to say again, a huge thank you. I just literally, I think that's it for me. If you just let you say the final, any thoughts? Or just
no, that's
let you wrap up.
Just a big thank you, James, Sir Brian, and Michael. It's been a great evening. So many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone
great
that's joined us.
Great fun.
Thank you, everyone.
And please do keep in touch. It's been really good to connect this evening. And I hope to see most of you in the flesh on the 13th of July.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Have a good evening.
I leave. Yeah.